Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. We will start the program with a recitation of Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لم تقولون ما لا تفعلون كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون إن الله يحب الذين يقاتلون في سبيله صفا كأنهم بنيان مرصوص. وإذ قال موسى لقومه يا قوم لم تؤذونني وقد تعلمون أني رسول الله إليكم فلما زاغوا أزاغ الله قلوبهم والله لا يهدي القوم الفاسقين. وإذ قال عيسى ابن مريم يا بني إسرائيل إني رسول الله إليكم مصدقا لما بين يدي من التوراة ومبشرا برسول يأتي من بعده اسمه أحمد. فلما جاءهم بالبينات قالوا هذا سحر مبين. ومن أظلم ممن افترى على الله الكذب وهو يدعى إلى الإسلام والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. يريدون ليطفئوا نور الله بأفواههم والله متم نوره ولو كره الكافرون. هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا هل أدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم من عذاب أليم تؤمنون بالله ورسوله وتجاهدون في سبيل الله بأموالكم وأنفسكم ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. يغفر لكم ذنوبكم ويدخلكم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار ومساكن طيبة في جنات عدن ذلك الفوز العظيم. وأخرى تحبونها نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا أنصار الله كما قال عيسى ابن مريم للحواريين من أنصاري إلى الله قال الحواريون نحن أنصار الله. فآمنت طائفة من بني إسرائيل وكفرت طائفة فأيدنا الذين آمنوا على عدوهم فأصبحوا ظاهرين. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. We're now very fortunate to have Dr. Nadine El-Enany, who will be speaking to us about her book, Bordering Britain, Law, Race and Empire. Dr. Nadine is a reader in law at Birkbeck School of Law and co-director of the Center for Research on Race and Law. Nadine teaches and researches in the fields of migration and refugee law, European Union law, protest and criminal justice. Her current research projects, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, focus on questions of race and justice in death in custody cases, and the role of law in addressing health inequalities arising from environmental harm. Nadine has written for a wide range of different publications, including The Guardian, the LRB Blog, Pluto Blog, Verso Blog, Open Democracy, Media Diversified, Left Forward, and Critical Legal Thinking. Her book, which she's talking about in part today, Bordering Britain, Law, Race and Empire, is published by Manchester University Press. And it's a real pleasure to have her here and speaking to us. Thank you very much. Please.
Thanks for that introduction, Miqdad, and thank you very much for inviting me, and to all of you for coming today. So yeah, I'm going to talk about my book, Bordering Britain. And in doing so, I'm going to start by talking about how race science was at the heart of British colonial rule, and about how the contemporary British border as we know it today is a legal fiction, but one with, of course, very real and violent effects. The border was invented to erase from memory how Britain came to be one of the richest places in the world, and to justify the exclusion from Britain of those who Britain's wealth was stolen from, and those it subjugated in its colonies. So what follows is a retelling of Britain's history, one which challenges mythological narratives about the British Empire and the making of Britain, and hopefully allows for new imaginings for its future. So I will be talking a bit about law today, and so it's important to kind of think a bit about what law is rather than what law claims to be. So law announces itself as a rational and neutral set of measures, but it is necessarily based on fiction. So what differentiates the violence that is enacted by law from the violence enacted outside law is the idea that when law is enforced, it's done so legitimately because it derives from a higher sovereign power. Of course, the law proclaims itself to come from secular origins, but of course, and the sovereign is understood as being of a higher order than those subject to its power. All of this is, of course, fantasy, but one which is given form and substance through things like custom, institutions, legislation, and systems of government. And of course, the fantasy on which British and more widely European sovereignty is based is a particular kind of fantasy, a white Christian supremacist fantasy that drove heady white men in particular to cross oceans and lands and conquer peoples, enslave them, massacre them, steal their lands and resources, enriching themselves and their families and descendants to come. So thinking a bit about race science and its relationship to bordering, British imperial administrations depended on exploiting hierarchies that were based on supposed differences between categories of people. The use of race as an ordering principle played an important part in enabling and justifying colonialism. In order for colonialists to conquer entire civilizations, they needed to be known and filed under terms familiar to the colonizer. Anglo-European scholars of the 1800s and 1900s provided the impetus for colonization in their repeated intellectual reductions of entire Anglo-European civilizations as readable, translatable, and ultimately understandable as inferior to Western civilization, and therefore conquerable. By contrast, non-Western scholarship until this day remains posited as an inferior generator of culture and knowledge. Prime among the criteria for knowing and ordering civilization in the colonial era was race. The production and signification, so the attachment of meaning to the racial in post-Enlightenment era writing, depended on the use of tools from science and history. And this makes it especially important to ask, as Denise Ferreira da Silva does, how racial subjects are created in order to avoid their reproduction, as already being differently constituted historical beings before they enter the modern political space as subaltern subjects. So race becomes an ordering principle at a time when imperial formations were competing with nation states for dominance. There was a fixation in the Enlightenment period with categorization and classification, establishing what is inside and what is outside. And so the important question at the time was who constitutes humanity? And this could only be ascertained, of course, by determining what lies outside of the human. And to this end, the context of European colonialism meant that understandings of humanity were based on a distinction between Europeans and non-Europeans. And the justification of European colonization on the basis of white supremacy wasn't then predetermined, but a result of these theorizations of fixed racial difference. So the violence of colonialism isn't, of course, only semantic. An extreme level of physical threat, force, and brutality was administered to maintain the British Empire. Colonizers have always been aware that despite their claim to have founded a durable order, that order rested on a reversible relation of forces. The possibility for the reversal of colonialism through actions of resistance movements required extreme violence and its constant threat against subjugated populations. At the same time, dismissals and brutal crackdowns of struggles for self-determination in the colonies necessitated justifications that rested on constructions of difference and their accentuation in official discourse. The tendency in Enlightenment thought to categorize nature and man into types, the exaggeration of what were assumed to be general features, and the reduction of innumerable objects to orderable and describable types was applied with devastating consequences in the colonial context to people. Ideas about racial superiority and inferiority underpinned the division of cultures into civilized and uncivilized and served as normative justifications for colonial conquest. For instance, British colonizers subjugated Aboriginal Australians and Native Americans, constructing them as having failed to socially progress, partly on account of their different relationship to land, and thereby justified colonial intervention, land dispossession, and rule. Within an Anglo-European understanding of linear time, Indigenous people were seen as being primitive and contemptible, inhabiting a bygone era, one which Europeans had transcended. Edward Said thus describes sovereign orders as a monstrous chain of command based on divisions of humanity and progress. For Said, the consequences of dividing humanity into clearly different cultures, histories, traditions, societies, and even races cannot be survived. And there is, of course, a specificity to the version of white supremacy which underpinned British colonialism. Colonists operating at the height of the expansion of the British Empire propagated the idea that white British people were supreme over all other people, including white Europeans who were engaged in their own colonial projects. In 1877, for instance, in Confessions of Faith, Cecil Rhodes wrote, "It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses." Considering that Britain invaded 90% of the current 193 members of the United Nations, it is not difficult to imagine the depth of arrogance and political investment of British colonists in the idea of white British supremacy. So how does this relate to migration law? The ideas and practices of racial ordering that I've discussed are constitutive. They make up contemporary British immigration laws. British immigration laws allocate life and death on the basis of whether or not a person meets the criteria for a legal status and prevents those who don't from accessing Britain. And so it's central to ongoing processes of colonial dispossession. Law is the structure which underpins Britain's self-construction as an enclosed space within which resources and wealth that were obtained in the course of colonial conquest belong to Britons conceived in large part as white. Law's categorization of people into groups, those with and without rights of entry and stay, make the latter disproportionately at risk of violence and premature death. The effect of law's division of people into groups with differentiated rights is to create hierarchies of people, some of whom have access to territory or basic resources, a chance of survival, whilst others don't. And of course, the particular population immigration law targets for abandonment is the racialized poor, the vast majority of whom have personal, ancestral, or geographical histories of colonization. For racialized people, the border is not easily navigable, nor is it temporally and spatially limited. Whiteness as embodied racial power is clear in the ease with which white people cross borders and move through white spaces. They tend not to be subject to visa requirements that are stringent. They tend not to be subject to racial profiling, whereas the vast majority of racialized people are unable to purchase tickets for travel, to board planes due to visa rules and carrier sanctions, and are disproportionately stopped and searched at airports. So this encounter with the border is a racializing process, the result of which people are made disproportionately vulnerable to harm. And here the definition of racism I'm using is Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition about making people, essentially the state sanctions the production of particular groups as being vulnerable to premature death. So it's a bit of a mouthful, the definition, but the idea behind it is that it's structural abandonment of populations, making particular groups of people vulnerable, disproportionately vulnerable to premature death. So we can see how this operates in the way that I was just talking about with immigration laws. So people who don't have a right to enter Britain are forced to undertake treacherous, often fatal journeys. The absence of a right of stay can mean homelessness, a lack of access to healthcare, confinement to a camp or detention centre, and deportation. People in these conditions are at risk of being subjected to physical and mental violence and death. As we saw with the hostile environment policy, racialized people also experience internal borders, which are invisible and permeable for most white people. Borders follow people around and surround them as they try to access work, welfare, healthcare, education, and other civil associations and access to justice. Sarah Keenan has shown how borders' attachment to racialized people means that they take with them the space of the border. In her work on race and time, she describes race as a temporal category to be understood in terms of how long racialized people are able to survive in the world. The lives and futures of those without a right of entry and stay are made precarious. People without a legal status come to occupy, to borrow from Edward Said again, a time that is over. So if we take this spatial and temporal understanding of British immigration law, we can see how it works to place land, resources, and healthcare, welfare, security, and opportunities, all of which can be understood as modern day manifestations of stolen colonial wealth, out of reach of the vast majority of those with ancestral or geographical histories of colonization. Sarah Ahmed writes that what is reachable is determined precisely by orientations we have already taken. A world that was made white through colonialism is home only for bodies that can inhabit whiteness. Bodies, she writes, remember histories of colonialism, even when we forget them. So histories of colonialism surface on the body. The result is that race becomes a social as well as a bodily given. Colonialism has meant that the vast majority of racialized people have inherited the impossibility of extending the body's reach. They must risk their lives for what the beneficiaries of colonialism take for granted, carrying with them the deadly weight of colonial history, a burden that they've inherited. So while categorization is of course important for meaning, it's when the alignment of systems of categorization and the assertion of power come together that racial subjugation is possible. So it's helpful to understand race, in Alana Lenton's words, as a series of logics and structures that mutually inform and constitute the other. Understanding migration law as a racial regime of power, as part of a colonial edifice, allows us to see the danger of accepting legal categories as givens. While legal categories may be articulated in terms that are race neutral, their effect is to enable the colonial state to administer racial violence. So legal categories like refugee and citizen legitimize the incarceration, marginalization, expulsion, and death of those who are deemed not to fulfill the criteria required for the granting of these statuses. The widespread acceptance of legal categories of people moving as defined in international and domestic law thus normalizes the racial violence in which the legal system is implicated. So the assumption that legal categories are neutral and fair in masking this violence suggests that we need to engage in a task of unmasking, which is a telling of a more honest history of law and its relationship to colonial violence. And on that basis, we can challenge the fiction that Britain is a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state. Of course, Britain wouldn't be the wealthy, plentiful place that it is without its colonial history. Colonialism and slavery were key to its industrialization and the growth of its capitalist economy. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery only to raise the equivalent of 17 billion pounds in compensation to be paid to British slave owners for the loss of their property. The compensation scheme was the largest state-sponsored payout in British history until it was superseded by the bank bailouts of 2008. The funds paid out built and infused Britain's commercial, cultural, imperial, and political institutions. Wealth derived from British slave ownership has by no means been evenly distributed in Britain. It has helped to enrich and sustain elite institutions, families, and has sown inequality deep into the fabric of British society, helping to make it the most unequal place in Europe. Yet Britain's healthcare system, welfare state, transportation infrastructure, cultural and educational institutions, battered and unequally accessible as they are in the wake of privatization and austerity policies, are colonially derived, along with the private wealth amassed over the course of the British Empire, retained after its defeat by systems of inheritance. So to see how Britain came to be understood, not as what it is, the spoils of empire, but as a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state, we need to travel back to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which are particularly important decades in the story of immigration law and the making of modern Britain. As colonial populations fought the British from their territories, British lawmakers fast abandoned the myth of imperial unity and equality and moved to introduce controls targeted at racialized colonial subjects and Commonwealth citizens. This legislation culminated in the 1981 British Nationality Act, which raised for the first time the spectre of a post-imperial, territorially defined and circumscribed Britain. It severed a notionally white, geographically distinct Britain from the remainder of its colonies and Commonwealth. Through the concept of patriality, which was invented for this piece of legislation, the 1971 Immigration Act had made whiteness intrinsic to British identity. Only patrials, those born in Britain or with a parent born in Britain, had a right of abode and therefore a right of entry and stay in Britain. In 1971, a person born in Britain was 98% likely to be white. The 1981 Act continued this process of racial exclusion by constructing British citizenship on the foundation of the 1971 Act's concept of patriality, tying citizenship to the right of entry and abode. Conservative Home Secretary William Whitelaw said of the Act at the time that it is time to dispose of the lingering notion that Britain is somehow a haven for all those whose countries we used to rule. So the move was both materially and symbolically significant. A territorially distinct Britain and a concept of citizenship that made Britishness commensurate with whiteness made it clear that Britain, the landmass and everything within it, belongs to Britons conceived intrinsically as white. The 1981 Act did not therefore signify an end to British colonialism, but was itself a colonial maneuver. It was an act of appropriation, a final seizure of the wealth and infrastructure secured through centuries of colonial conquest. So understanding Britain as a contemporary colonial space in this way serves to partially collapse the distinction between settler and non-settler colonial contexts. While it's now an accepted argument in critical scholarship that settler colonialism is ongoing and structural, the same critique has not been applied to non-settler forms of colonialism, which are considered to have ended. Yet the border drawn around the spoils of British colonial conquest via immigration and nationality law amounts to an unredressed act of colonial theft. Due to mainstream understandings of property as being fixed and immovable in space and time, theft via the passing of immigration controls can be more difficult to conceptualize. Along with the resources and labor stolen in the course of colonialism, the social and cultural networks and relationships that were annihilated or radically changed as a result of colonial conquest were also material losses. Colonial dispossession not only determined the contemporary distribution of wealth, but also radically altered subjectivity in the sense of what people desire, consider themselves as entitled to, and understand themselves to be. Theft of intangibles such as economic growth and prospects, opportunities, life chances, psyches, and futures occur in all colonial contests, settler or otherwise. So the effect of the 1981 Act, along with the changes to immigration law that I've discussed, was to put the wealth of Britain out of the reach of the vast majority of people from whom it was stolen, who were racialized through colonial processes, most of whom have a geographical or ancestral history connected to British colonialism. But of course, immigration law is not only the means of obstruction of movement, it's also the means through which legal status is granted. And so one of the problems that this raises is that people have to appeal to immigration law in order to be granted legal status. So in order to be recognized as having legal status, one must appeal to the British authorities to determine entitlement of their access to status. And this is, of course, problematic because it reinforces the idea that colonial wealth, as it manifests in Britain, belongs behind its borders only to be accessed with permission. So similar to the way in which Indigenous people in Canada and Australia must submit to the rules and evidentiary standards of those colonial legal systems in order to be recognized as having enforceable rights to land that was stolen from them, those with ancestral and geographical and personal histories of British colonialism who wish to access Britain and stolen colonial wealth within Britain have to submit to the rules and evidentiary standards of British immigration law. So in this way, a kind of facade or a fiction of racial inclusion has been written in the form of paths to legal status recognition, to legal status, where immigration status is doled out to a select few racialized people who can fulfill the criteria required. But of course, such recognition is always on the terms of the colonial state. Meanwhile, the vast majority of racialized people are prevented from accessing Britain and its wealth due to the effect of immigration law. So what I would argue here is that every time British subjecthood, or in its modern form, what we will be talking about citizenship, every time it's bestowed, it can never be anything other than a colonial act. So when a status is granted, that is a colonial act. In the colonial era, British subjecthood was held up as being a superior category from which the civilizing benefits of British rule flowed. But of course, we know that British colonialism was genocide, mass murder, slavery, dispossession of land, exploitation of labor, and theft of resources, all predicated on the idea of white British supremacy. Even so-called free racialized British subjects who sought to move to different parts of the British Empire were met with racist immigration laws in places like Canada and Australia. So British subjecthood didn't therefore protect racialized subject from the violence of white British supremacy. Its very existence as a legal category was a manifestation of that violence. We know that whenever it has suited the British government, it has treated its subjects as aliens for legal purposes, evicting them from the protection of the law with devastating consequences. And of course, the most obvious recent example in that respect is the hostile environment policy, which saw many of the Windrush generation and their children denied access to healthcare, housing, employment, and other vital services, and their detention and expulsion and the death of some of them. So the traditional acceptance of legal categories as being defined in international and domestic law has the effect of concealing law's role in producing racialized subjects and racial violence. And it also stops us from understanding law itself as racial violence. Take, for example, the category of the refugee that is relatively valorized as compared with the irregularized migrants. Individuals falling outside the legal definition of a refugee are often described as illegal, irregular, or economic migrants, and are at risk of removal and denied access to the basic means of life. A decision to deny legal status carries serious, sometimes fatal consequences. So it's important to address the historical contingency and artificiality of legal categories in order to help us to challenge the idea that Britain is a legitimately bordered sovereign state, and also to open the way up for a discourse that might be more reparative and more generative of solidarity with migrants in struggle. Because of course, legal status doesn't alter the way in which racialized people are cast in white spaces as undeserving guests, outsiders, or intruders, as here today, but potentially gone tomorrow. Immigration law is the prop that is used to teach white British citizens that what Britain plundered from its colonies is theirs and theirs alone. Immigration law is not therefore the seemingly harsh but fair mode through which the deserving are separated from the undeserving. Instead, it's a crucial mechanism for ensuring that colonial wealth remains out of the hands of those from whom it was stolen. Racialized people in Britain, whether categorized as citizens, migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers, are habitually understood as having come from somewhere else. Britain's post-colonial articulation of its borders and national identity has driven the assumption that anyone who is not white could not be from Britain. Manifestations of this assumption are heard daily across Britain, whether in the form of the subtly disguised racist question, "Where do you come from originally?" or the avowed racist slur, "Go back to where you came from." In 2013, Theresa May's Home Office plastered the decree "Go home or face arrest" on vans commissioned to drive around London in areas where racialized people live. Leave, which became the designation for the campaign for Britain's withdrawal from the EU, began to take on a double meaning, embodying the go home dictum as a rejection of anyone deemed to be a migrant. Meanwhile, people considered not to have a legal right to remain in Britain are expelled to places that are not home. The legal system thus enacts the go home decree, the deportation flights carried forward by the justification that people without legal status do not belong in Britain. Post-colonial critique might be able to offer us the possibility for a counter-pedagogy to that of law. It might be able to teach us something different. Immigration law's lesson is one of differentiation in human worth and the crystallization of racial hierarchies through legal categorization. For the colonial British state to function, it has always depended on Britons, 87% of whom are white, to imbibe a sense of entitlement and superiority over racialized people. Immigration, refugee, and citizenship law regimes, in their legitimization of differentiated access to resources according to immigration status, convey the lesson that the British national project is one of white ownership of colonial spoils, a project which is under constant threat from people who do not belong in Britain. A post-colonial critique can offer a different lesson and allow us to disrupt that narrative. And I'm going to talk a bit about how that might be. So what I say is that we should try to change the language that we use and also conceptualize irregularized migration differently. So-called host states should be understood as colonial spaces and irregularized movement as anti-colonial resistance. By calling for a reconceptualization of irregularized migration as anti-colonial resistance, I'm not really relying on a reformist strategy where we would be demanding states facilitate migration, not only because that's something that is very unlikely to happen, as we know, there's certainly no political will for anything like that, but also migration in and of itself doesn't actually solve problems of redistribution of wealth. Of course, there is limited redistribution that occurs through things like sending back remittances, but that does very little in the way of building the autonomy and infrastructure of former colonies. And of course, I'm not saying that irregularized strategy should be taken on, irregularized migration should be taken on as a practical strategy as such for resisting ongoing colonial violence because of the dangers involved in that for individuals. But this is importantly not to deny that irregularized migration can be seen as embodying a practice of resistance in contesting the border and forcing a redistributive element into the relationship between Britain and its former colonies, an element that is otherwise refused formal acknowledgement. Indeed, it's precisely the irregularity, illegality of the relationship that gives irregularized migration its radical anti-colonial and reparative redistributive dimension. In being illegal, it amounts to a forcible return of something that was stolen in a context in which the laws being breached, immigration and border controls, are designed specifically to obstruct such an outcome. Nevertheless, irregularized people are made vulnerable to extreme conditions of racial terror, both in their journeys and in their attempts to cross borders, as well as in their efforts to navigate legal status recognition processes and hostile environments pre and post arrival. So rather, the reconceptualization I offer of irregularized migration as anti-colonial resistance is intended as an insistence on the recognition that the mainstream and accepted story of Britain's making is fiction. This story serves to justify the violence and injustice of Britain's contemporary border regime. Rather than being seen as rightfully at the mercy of legal status recognition processes, racialized people must both be understood and understand themselves to be collectively entitled to reclaiming wealth that was accumulated in the course of colonial dispossession. There's an urgent need for a politics of migrant solidarity and racial justice in colonial context, which resists that of state recognition. Such a politics, in the words of Bell Hooks, would require that we stop being so preoccupied with looking to the other for recognition. Instead, we should be recognizing ourselves and seeking to make contact with all those who would engage us in a constructive manner. As scholars and activists, we must acknowledge the connections between historical and ongoing racial projects of capitalist accumulation and contemporary migratory movements, and question former colonial powers' claims to legitimate and defensible sovereign borders policed via immigration law. So understanding how Britain came to be one of the wealthiest places in the world and how immigration laws deployed to exclude from its national project those at whose expense Britain was built is one of the important steps towards formulating internationalist, anti-imperialist racial justice strategies. Colonial subjects dispossessed of resources and then of access to Britain were intrinsic to its making. As George Orwell wrote in 1939, the overwhelming bulk of the British proletariat does not live in Britain, but in Asia and Africa. He described the British Empire as nothing but a mechanism for exploiting cheap coloured labour. Aditya Mukherjee has shown how at the heart of colonialism lay surplus appropriation from the colony to the metropolis. In the case of India, unrequited transfers, whereby the colony paid for the export of its own products to Britain, served as a massive and protracted drain on the Indian economy, while simultaneously contributing to Britain's economic sustenance and growth, a pattern that was repeated across the empire. The fact that colonized populations grew and sustained the British economy is contrasted with the official denial that Britain owes anything to those it enslaved and colonized. This erasure manifests in part through a refusal to engage in processes which would see Britain pay reparations to colonized nations. In 2015, then Prime Minister David Cameron, on a visit to Jamaica, refused to apologize or engage on the question of payment of reparations for Britain's role in transatlantic slavery, preferring instead to move on from this painful legacy and continue to build for the future. The future building Cameron was particularly interested in was a £25 million British aid-funded prison to which people with Jamaican nationality convicted of a criminal offence in Britain could be sent to serve out their sentence. Of course, this particular project didn't occur, but Britain has contributed to such prison building projects elsewhere, for example, in Nigeria. The presence of racialized people in Britain from countries with histories of colonization has the effect of challenging and troubling white supremacist structures. Sarah Keenan has noted the way in which significant political potential can come when particular bodies that do not belong, according to dominant networks of belonging, nonetheless remain in space. This troubling occurs in part through the taking up of physical space, but also in the serving as a defiant reminder of Britain's colonial identity and the origins of its wealth. The arrival of the historically dispossessed in what was the heart of the British Empire had the effect of troubling racialized depictions of colonized populations as backward and uncivilized. Migration thus poses in itself a challenge to colonial assertions of the stunted development and progress of colonized places and their populations, assertions which served as justifications for colonial rule. So to conclude, The Imperial Vanishing Act, performed by changes to immigration and nationality laws in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, cast Britain's imperial history into the shadows. The British Empire, about which most Britons know little, can be remembered fondly as a moment of past glory, as a gift once given to the world. The erasure has been so complete that Conservative MP Liam Fox could declare in 2016 that the United Kingdom is one of the few countries in the European Union that does not need to bury its 20th century history. And in 2019, the British government could take umbrage at the European Union's perfectly accurate description of Gibraltar in a legal document as a British colony. In announcing itself as post-colonial, Britain cut itself off symbolically and physically from the colonies and the Commonwealth, taking with it what it had plundered. While Britain may appear to be an island, it is in fact everywhere. The British Empire's legacies of racism, slavery, labour exploitation, land dispossession, bordering and plunder are to this day felt viscerally across the world. It is only with the confinement of British colonialism to the past that its former subjects, whether categorised today as refugees, citizens, migrants or asylum seekers, can be understood to have come from somewhere else. If Britain is acknowledged as being everywhere, its colonial legacy still reaching like tentacles across the world, then Britain is where we are from. In this way, the dictum "go home" becomes paradoxically, subversively, an invitation to stay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for your talk, and it's obviously a huge topic that you've been able to cover. I'm going to just ask a couple of questions on behalf of a couple of people who sent them through. Firstly, what do you see as the way forward? It's very easy to say. It was not easy. I'm paraphrasing, but actually, it's possible to talk about the challenges of the way that everything is currently, but how can we find a solution that is practical and possible?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think that question is a bit premature, because I think that there's so much work that needs to be done in changing the way we think and speak and understand the law, questions of the law, questions of who is entitled to come to Britain and who isn't, who's entitled to access resources and who isn't. You know, what I've tried to kind of show is that we need to be thinking about immigration law not as, you know, part of a structure of law that is neutral and fair as it claims to be, and it must be just because it's the law, but that it's actually something that really skews reality and has very violent effects. And, you know, there's no political will for a change to that law. And so I think it's for us, when we're thinking as organizers, as activists, as anti-racist activists, as people who support migrants, that we're being careful how we use the law. So one of the practical things I'd say that comes out of the book, and an argument that I make, is that when we appeal to the law, so when we say, oh, this group of people should be protected because they're citizens, as was a claim made in relation to the Windrush scandal, in relation to Windrush generation, a lot of people argued, okay, they should be protected because they're citizens. We should be aware that when we make that claim, who is not being protected by that, or who is put under the bus as a result of that. So people who are irregularized, people who are not citizens, people who can't prove that status, you know, what happens to them when we appeal to the law in that way? You know, how can we actually formulate justice demands that don't leave behind or don't exclude people who maybe don't fall into the category of the good immigrant, of the law-abiding immigrant, of the one who, you know, the ones who paid their taxes, the ones who work, the ones who are citizens, etc. You know, how do we make sure the claims that we're making are in line with the sort of arguments I'm making around a need for a more reparative and justice-oriented approach to the protection of to the border, you know, thinking about it as something that is preventing most people in the world who have a history of British colonialism from being able to access stolen wealth.
Thank you very much. Do you think that there are any specific areas that need to be targeted first beyond others, or is it the system as a whole?
So it depends. I mean, if we're talking about, you know, actual changes to the law that could be made, I mean, of course, there are so many things that would be wonderful if those changes could be made, like, you know, the no recourse to public funds law, which prevents people who are not on indefinite leave statuses from being able to access basic resources. You know, and there's deportation laws. Of course, there are lots of things that I would campaign in terms of changing the law, because there's so many aspects of the law which are unfair and which see a huge amount of violence take place against migrants or people without a secure status. So there are, of course, lots of things. But I think, again, what I'm trying to point out are the structural problems. So even though we might tweak the law here and there, even though we might make a change here, which are important, of course, for individuals who are ensnared within this violent system, and of course lawyers do that important work every day, I suppose the message that I'm sending out is supposed to be targeted at activists, as scholars, as people who have a bit more, I guess, luxury of being able to think more critically about the system, and to also understand how it works and why it works the way that it does.
Thank you. Can I ask Miqdad Asaria?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for that.
Right.
I'm not a legal scholar, but I think one of the acts which I find quite interesting is the 1905 Aliens Act.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't seem to obviously fit with colonialism. From what I understood, it was more kind of targeted at Eastern European Jewish population.
Right.
But it seems to be the root cause of a lot of these other legislation from what so I was wondering if you could help us contextualize that a little bit and put it into the picture.
Sure. Yeah, it's as you say, it's a really important piece of legislation, because it was actually Britain's first generalized immigration control legislation passed in 1905, as you say. And as you say, the target was primarily East European Jews who were fleeing pogroms and persecution at the time. What's interesting about that act, and I cover it in the first chapter of the book because it is important in the telling of the story, is it is, of course, the precedent. It's the first piece of generalized immigration on which all others built. But what's interesting about it is that it was passed, it didn't include the targeting of British subjects, who, of course, because of course Britain was an empire at the time, and it had subjects, but it didn't include them because it wasn't racialized British subjects were not traveling to Britain. The movement up until 1948 and even beyond was outward, white Britons outward going, populating the colonies. So this piece of legislation was targeted specifically at poor East Europeans who were seeking protection from persecution in Britain. But what's interesting about the legislation is that it borrowed from legislation that had been passed in the Dominions, in settler colonies, which had been passed against racialized British subjects. So I mentioned earlier legislation had been passed in Canada, in Australia, other colonies, like the colony of Natal. They had all passed legislation to prohibit undesirable migration. And essentially what they were passing was legislation to target people coming from India, for example, seeking to travel to Canada, people traveling from other areas of the British Empire to the white settler colonies who were seeking to federate as white, define themselves as white, of course, as against a racialized indigenous population. And so they didn't want racialized migration. And so that was so although Britain kind of outwardly disapproved of that legislation, because Britain didn't want to pass legislation to that as being the motherland, as being the mother country. The idea was it was meant to be sort of technically open to all, and it was really propagating this myth that the empire was a place of equality and unity, and any passing of immigration control legislation that was racist would clearly challenge that myth or show the myth up for what it was. And so Britain wasn't prepared to do that until the 60s. It didn't do it until the 60s. It did everything else it could since 1948 to try to stop that migration, but it didn't actually pass that legislation until the 60s, and finally in 1971, as I discussed. and kind of closed off that route pretty much altogether. But it did borrow technically it borrowed things like carrier sanctions originate in the 1905 Act, the definitions around undesirable migration, the different kinds of tools that were used to prevent migrants. They were all kind of borrowed from legislation that was targeted at racialized British subjects. So there is that connection with modern day, with contemporary immigration law, which of course its whole origin is in that moment in the 60s where Britain's empire is being defeated, and it retaliates by kind of pulling up the drawbridge, passing that legislation, preventing people from being able to come, and of course turning its attention towards Europe, thinking, okay, maybe European integration is the way that we retain our political and international political influence and power. The empire is kind of on its way out. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Can I just follow up with, so then they passed this 1948 nationality, and that seems to be, it just seems counterintuitive. Why would they pass something that gave everybody in the colonies citizenship effectively?
Yeah, so what happened there is, it's a really important question in the story, because in 1948, Canada was passing its own citizenship legislation, and it was defining citizenship, Canadian citizenship, not as deriving from British subjecthood, but as being its own separate Canadian citizenship. So obviously moving sort of away from the empire, and Britain was really annoyed about this. The authorities were basically worried that this was kind of a breakup of the empire. And of course, the dominions were very important. The white dominions were really important to Britain politically and economically. And so what Britain did is it thought, okay, what we'll do is a huge symbolic gesture. We'll pass the 1948 British Nationality Act and roll out the status called Citizenship of the United Kingdom and Colonies. And that status was rolled out across the empire. But I say it's wrong to call it citizenship. I mean, in its name, Citizenship of the United Kingdom and Colonies, it clearly, there's a flavor of something else there. There's the United Kingdom and colonies, clearly conceived as two separate spaces. Also, if you look at Hansard at the time, parliamentarians in their discussion around this piece of legislation are saying, some of them are saying, oh, this sounds, citizenship, that's really Republican. We're a monarchy, it has a nasty flavor to it. And the government was reassuring them, saying, no, this is just a backdoor to its subjecthood. It's just a nicer way of saying subjecthood. So that was the feeling. And at that point, no contemplation in all the discussion around the 1948 Act did anyone speak about migration, potential migration to Britain, because it wasn't even conceived of. It wasn't happening. It wasn't a thing. The movement at that time was outward of white Britons going and populating settler colonies as well in 1948. So it just wasn't even predicted as being potentially an issue. And when legislation was passed later on, parliamentarians are saying, immigration legislators are saying things like, well, we couldn't possibly have conceived of this kind of migration happening. So it just wasn't predicted. And when in 1948 the Windrush arrived, it came as a complete shock to the government, who knew they could do nothing but admit them. But what they did do is then go about kind of doing everything they possibly could to try to dissuade anybody else from traveling. So they made life very difficult, refused to pass anti-discrimination legislation, wouldn't provide access to housing, that sort of thing. And it's a myth, by the way, that the government encouraged this migration post-war. Although some institutions like London Transport and the NHS made their own recruitment schemes, in reality, the government was doing everything it could to put pressure on dependency governments to stop people from being able to travel, to stop racialized people from being able to travel. So that's another kind of thing that obviously came up during Windrush, like, oh, these people welcome post-war. It's completely untrue. That 1948 Act had nothing to do with immigration. It was purely a kind of show of strength of the empire.
Okay, we have a number of questions, but I know that we're running out of time because at 9:15 is stopping. So I'm going to ask both of you to ask your questions together, and then Nadine can wrap up. So Mohammed Khalil, do you mind starting? Okay, whilst we're waiting for him, Zaid Shelchi. Zaid?
Thanks very much, Muqdad. Nadine, thanks for an interesting talk. Your talk is all about white supremacy, but you know, there's plenty of warring factions within white British. So England versus Welsh versus Scottish. Obviously, the troubles with wars against the Irish and of course against Europeans. I mean, I think the picture is a lot more complicated than you paint it to be.
I mean, I think the picture is complicated, but obviously the concern that I have in relation to the book that I've written is about the British border and its origins in immigration law, because in the origins of the British border in Britain's empire. Because I think people don't really see a connection between British imperialism and the colonial era and modern day contemporary immigration law, because usually discussions around immigration law are that, of course, every country controls its borders, and that's totally fair. Whereas when settler colonies, for instance, are talked about, there's an acknowledgement that these are ongoing territories that are disputed, contested. You know, there are people claiming that that land belongs to them. Sovereignty is contested. Sovereignty of Britain's sovereignty isn't contested. And that's what I'm trying to do through the book, is to say we should be contesting Britain's claim to being a legitimately border sovereign nation state, because it is actually a colonially configured territory, which is up for grabs. I mean, in the sense that it is built on the wealth of wealth that was derived through colonial conquest, which means that it should be seen similar to settler colonial context as being contested colonial space, in which we see the same patterns of racial violence that you see in colonial conquest, whether that's militarized forms of policing that are disproportionately targeted at racialized populations, whether we look at the Grenfell Tower fire and the way in which racialized people are disproportionately at risk of dying in their homes or being killed by the police in the street. So, you know, I mean, those are the kinds of things I'm concerned about. And of course, we see the border also extend its operation into other groups of people who are, you know, less proximate to whiteness than others, whether we're talking about East Europeans or you know, and of course, you know, the whole idea of race is that it fluctuates, it's influx, it changes in definitions over time, it changes meanings over time. You know, Stuart Hall writes about it as a floating signifier. So of course it is complex, of course it's complicated, but you know, the story that I'm trying to tell is quite a specific one.
Thank you, Nadine. I'm going to try and squeeze one final question in, if I can, from Mohammed Khalil, who is not in a position to speak, so he's asked me to speak on his behalf. So why has it taken such a long time, relatively speaking, multiple generations, for a critical mass of public consciousness to begin to have an impact on British institutions?
Why has it taken so long? I mean, it has taken a long time, because I mean, because of some of the stuff I was talking about at the beginning, of how embedded in our society, in our culture, in our educational establishments, in our media, in the official discourse, the skewed and inaccurate narratives around Britain's history. So when there's a counter narrative, it's rare. It doesn't get much airtime, because the airtime is all for the official discourse. So I suppose, you know, that's one reason why it's taken such a long time. But I think maybe the other side of that question is, why have we seen maybe now a kind of powerful reaction against those mythological narratives and attempt to challenge them in resistance movements? If we look at Black Lives Matter, for example, over the summer, you know, those were unprecedented protests for Britain, to see such a sustained and frequent and widespread anti-racism protests. And I think, you know, we can look for why that might have happened at that particular time. I don't think it was just it started as kind of solidarity protests in relation to the US, but then quickly arguments took off about the relevance of Black Lives Matter here in the UK. You know, we were dealing with We're in the middle of a pandemic, which saw racialized people disproportionately dying as a result of that. People were kind of at home some people were at home in a context in which suddenly things that we'd been told for decades and decades were impossible, as I think your question suggests, like restructuring of the world of work and, being able to have access, basically that they were suddenly saying that, oh, there is a magic money tree after all, they've been telling you that there isn't. And I think people kind of thought, hang on, things can shift, things can change, we can make things shift and change, and people took to the streets. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that's how I'd answer the question, is there's kind of two ways of looking at it, is why has there been action now? And I think some of the reasons I listed kind of explain that, and maybe it's why we can feel a bit more heartened as well, in terms of maybe going back to some of the earlier questions about what kind of needs to be done. I think things are being done,
Okay. Thank you very much, and we have come to the end of our time. It's it's been great to have you, really vibrant questions and answers, and I'm sure that hopefully we'll be able to have you again at some time in the next few years, and when your next book comes out, and we're able to benefit from that as well. Just a couple of announcements as we close up. This is the first in our next series of talks. So next week we're very fortunate to have Michael Weir, who'll be speaking to us on the role of faith in the US election, and he'll be reflecting on his insights from his time as the faith advisor in the Obama administration. And the week after, we have Dr. Ursula Bassis, and she's talking about looking over the early muhaddith's shoulder, a study of hadith production and transmission based on early documentary sources, following her paper on the topic. So some really good talks coming up. You can find out more on sicm.org.uk. So thank you all for participating, and hopefully we'll be able to see you soon again. Thank you very much.